Before we get started, I want to give you a little bit of context of what this platform cooperativism idea is all about, and welcome you here. So, my name is Camille Kerr. I am the Associate Director of the ICA Group. We're a nonprofit organization that partners with movement organizations and community groups to build worker co-ops that serve their constituents. On behalf of myself, of the ICA Group, of my co-organizers, Paul Shaw, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, as well as Nathan Schneider and Trevor Scholes. We're really excited to have you all in the room today, and this is the plenary event for our larger platform cooperativism conference that's been happening all day today and will continue all day tomorrow. So if you want to stop in tomorrow and learn more about the nuts and bolts and dig in with us, please do. So what is the context for this idea of platform cooperativism? I think a lot of us are feeling really hungry for an economy that humanizes us, an economy that's grounded in community, for an economy that's grounded in accountability and trust and reciprocity and connection, and not an economy that separates us from each other but brings us together. And I think many of us saw a little bit of hope in the idea of the sharing economy. I mean, it's such a good word, right? And the idea of the sharing economy at achieving some of these ideals of connecting us in a deeper way. But it's not sharing, right? It's gig, it's 1099, it's contingent. It's not sharing. That's not what bore out. So what we want to think about here, I mean, that was disappointing. It was disappointing, this idea, this concept that could have been something that connected us deeper and didn't. But can we still leverage technology to create that connection? If we root it in democracy, if we root it in community, if we use technology to build these movements, to actively combat the trends that the so-called sharing economy is pushing us towards, can we build something that actually does achieve those ideals that we're looking for in the economy? And today we heard some incredible examples of people piloting, people achieving this kind of change. We saw a platform cooperative of freelancers called SMART, where they are, unlike a lot of these platforms that are resisting at their very core, all I want to do is not be an employer. All I want to do is have you be separated from this and get rid of all these employment contracts. What they do is they say, hey, are you a freelancer? Come be employed. Let me give you that safety net that you don't have as a freelancer. And instead of having all of the money go up to investors, it's reinvested in more and more of the services that freelancers need to feel whole and feel part of our economy, right? So that's really happening right now, that cooperative. We saw a huge push for Buy Twitter, right? Something, a hashtag that like it's, you think, oh, that's just a concept, but they actually got a resolution in the board of Twitter to think about cooperativizing it. Right? And because of how many people voted in favor of it, it's going to be on a shareholder resolution again next year. That's something that elevates the profile in this concept as a real possibility for what our economy could look like moving forward. And for us at ICA, we're partnering with the Service Employees International Union on work to try to promote, to create technology that will serve childcare workers. Because if you look at childcare, I mean, family childcare providers, they do an incredible amount of work. They have to manage public subsidies. They have to manage administrative requirements of being a small business, licensing requirements, at the same time creating the best practices for quality for their children. And they do all that for $17,000 a year. They all do that on poverty wages. And so what are the technology solutions that we can build together, movements and business developers together? What are the solutions that we can build that can make these jobs better and make these lives better? And one of the really exciting things that we saw when we're talking to childcare providers is they're like, one of the things that I want you to do is get me discounts to massages, because that's the only way I'm staying in this industry, is I have something for myself. And if you listen to people about what they need, if you have structures that are responsive to humans, then can we create this economy that we want to build on the other side? That's the question that we have. And it's nascent, right? A lot of this is nascent. It needs wider acceptance. It needs advocates that are grounded in and are being listened to by the people who are making decisions about our economy, about our policies. And that's part of what that's what we want to move towards tonight with this conference and with this panel. But one thing before I hand it over is just a little bit of a caution, because we're talking about democratic technology. We're also talking about democratic ownership structures. But as we've seen, democracy in and of itself does not eradicate racism. Democracy in and of itself does not eradicate sexism, does not eradicate classism. And then these structures are tools that we need to use towards the type of economy that we need to build, right? Democracy is a tool that we use and a structure that we use to move towards these structures. So with that, I want to hand it over to this just incredible group of people. I'm so excited to have the word cooperative be in the title and then get to group these people together. So we have for you, starting with Yochai. He's a professor and he's the co-director of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, a Harvard Law professor, and he's been working in this field, in the online cooperation and mobilization field, since the 90s, right? And next to him we have Alicia Garza, who you may all know is a co-founder of Black Lives Matters and is currently the Strategy and Partnerships Director for NDWA. And Felicia, who is the president, and Felicia Wong, who's president and CEO of Roosevelt. And the Roosevelt Institute is setting an economic policy agenda that's really working on shared prosperity and the intersection of that and the growth that we need to see to stay sustainable. So, and then we're going to have moderating this session, the wonderful and very, we're just so pleased that Doug Rushkoff has committed so much of his time and energy to this field as an author who's written an incredible number of books, including Throwing Stones at the Google Bus, and has also started at CUNY, the Media Studies and Social Justice track. So please warmly welcome all these incredible people to the stage.
Okay, so first they came for the musicians, and I said nothing because I'm not a musician. Then they came for the cab drivers, and I said nothing because I'm not a cab driver. And then they came for the rest of us. Actually, I did say something back in around 1995 when the internet, which seemed like as promising as the sharing economy seemed, was there's no nice word for it, was privatized. And essentially a public infrastructure that had immense peer-to-peer possibilities became something very different. I mean, I remember the day that Netscape went public was the same day that Jerry Garcia died. And that's when I realized something was going to be left behind. But 20 years later, here we are, and maybe we can retrieve some of the egalitarian peer-to-peer quality of these platforms. We all have varying degrees of knowledge about platforms and the internet and different areas of expertise. So I want us all to feel free to stay in our own wheelhouses and venture out from your wheelhouse if something just seems, well, why do you guys think this? We do this, is all fine too. So let's just keep it open and human. I thought we should start by looking at the platforms themselves. In other words, what is wrong with the current platform situation? What's the problem of this absolutely privatized and monopoly-driven infrastructure? So I want to ask one sort of opening question to all of you. Maybe Felicia could take it first. That really just to bring from your experience how this has impacted what you do. So in your experience, what are the main, if any, drawbacks to organizing, to civic discussion, or to labor organization occurring on privately owned attention economy platforms that use algorithms with undisclosed priorities? Might more collective ownership of these platforms improve things in any way?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And Doug, that's such a good question. Actually, I'm here to learn from all of you and from my fellow platform participants the answer to that question. But the way I think about it is the problem, I like to think about the problem as situated in the structure of the larger economy, which is really what the Roosevelt Institute spends a lot of time thinking about and trying to change. Actually, we spend time thinking about how to change the way people believe the economy works, because that is actually a pretty deep underlying force that actually drives the way the economy does end up working. It doesn't have to work the way it does now. We've made a series of choices, in particular over the last 35 or 40 years, that has really privileged capital at the expense of labor, privileged markets, or the kind of fetishization that markets are free and they're always efficient and therefore they're always as fair as one could manage. But that's a set of beliefs, and therefore that drives a set of choices that leads you to a tax structure, for example, that privileges owners and not workers. That's just one example of the ways in which the platforms that you're talking about kind of live within a larger structure that now has a couple of different important features. I think the first is really actually quite significant concentration of corporations within sectors. If you look over the last, and obviously the platforms that matter to this conversation the most are, the very large platform companies, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple. You probably spent some time today talking about the piece that made the rounds in the last 10 or so days, essentially about the rise of the Trinet and the death of the internet. But at any rate, that is actually part of a larger economic phenomenon of corporate concentration. So across every industry, pharmaceuticals, food and beverage, healthcare, airlines, telecom, you see fewer and fewer firms making more and more profits and investing less and less in workers, in research and development, and in kind of basic operations. So that is and that is not democratic, nor is it actually contributing to real economic growth. So that's kind of the big picture in which I see the nascent, as Camille said, the nascent platform economy, platform cooperative movement trying to take root. So it's about, frankly, it's about breaking that system, or at least creating very significant fissures in it so that these other things can really grow. So the question is how we do that.
Right. So Alicia, you had experience creating a national or even global movement on largely private platforms. Were there obstacles that those platforms or that environment created for you?
I mean, I have a bunch of stories I want to tell about both how movements kind of come to be, because I would say that we used private platforms as a vehicle to do a particular thing, but that what makes movements alive, right, is that they are actually not on the internet. They're in people's communities, in our homes, in our workplaces, in our places of faith and worship. But I want to actually tell a different story, which is I couldn't agree with you more that this question of kind of corporate consolidation is a major threat to the future of humanity. And it's also a major threat to the potential for what strong alternatives can look like. Mm-hmm. So, two stories related to that. I work with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and for us, these private platforms are the new marketplace, right? They are the place where domestic workers sell their labor for their survival. And so when those platforms are not kind of held in the hands of the people, right? What it helps to further is a dynamic which has been true in domestic work for a long time, which is that it's basically like the Wild West economy, right? There are no kind of regulations around domestic work, and that's not an accident, it's intentional. That was a result, if you all don't know, of a compromise that was actually made, right? in the 1930s. So
Roosevelt.
lots of workers got overtime pay and all kinds of other kinds of regulations, except for domestic workers and agricultural workers. Why? Because those workers were black and brown and women, right? So for us, I think we're mostly trying to figure out, yes, there's a question of consolidation and privatization, which is essentially predatory and extractive. Then there's the question of that's how capitalism works, right? So the idea that we're going to kind of break open new avenues inside of a system that's working pretty well for what it's designed to do is challenging for us. So lots of what we try to think about at the Domestic Workers Alliance, which some of you heard about today, is how do we do our own thing, right? How do we actually build the alternatives that can compete, right, for hearts and minds that are actually beneficial, not just to the lives of workers, but to the potential that a new economy could exist. So there's that. On the Black Lives Matter side, how many of you heard that this past weekend there was supposed to be a civil war?
Oh, I did, yeah.
Yeah. How many of you heard that at some point over the last year there was a deep collusion between the United States and Russian operatives, Donald Trump, I should say, and Russian operatives? How many of you heard that? Cool. How many of you have heard that Facebook, for example, is trying to change its regulations around hate speech in response to some of the kind of underground organizing that Russian operatives were doing? Cool. I tell all those stories to say, one, there was no civil war last weekend, right? Just checking. Supposedly it was a collaboration between BLM and Antifa. We were going to kill all the white people. Those were literally memes that were being passed around the internet. And then I was getting tagged in those memes. And so, of course, I always know when something's happening on those platforms when I start getting a lot of death threats. Okay? The thing I think we have to also understand then about these kinds of private platforms is that not only are capitalists using them to extract more profit, to create more misery, but there's also kind of a new phenomenon that's happening, which is that there's what we might call a problem of white nationalists and white supremacists using these platforms, right? Using the lack of regulations, using the lack of democracy in this internet space to terrorize people. Full stop, yeah? And that's not just about hate speech or people disagreeing with each other, right? Having different political perspectives. That's actually about a new phenomenon that is happening online that's then being carried offline, and the merging of the personas that we create in these marketplaces, right, into the everyday activities of our lives. So, all that being said, I think that what's possible right now, and I'm glad, Camille, where are you? Yeah, I'm glad you talked about things like the corporatizing of Twitter, right? Things that are actually not just putting these tools into the hands of the people, and by the hands of, I mean also empowering people to make decisions over their own lives, which to me is at the core of what democracy looks like. But it's also challenging the dynamics that I think are kind of inherent to capitalism, right? Predatory, extractive, and overall bad for people, period.
Thanks. And Yochai, how are these values so effectively or even intentionally embedded into the platforms that we use, and workers in particular, I guess?
So I'm going to weave away a little bit from what you asked and really try to follow up and read Felicia and Alicia. No, because you were both talking about power in different dimensions. Market power done through market structuring, platform power in the employment relationship and its extractive form. I think what you raised, Alicia, is sort of the brand new thing that we've seen probably most powerfully since Gamergate, which is power of a distributed universe of people coming together to abuse precisely the open distributed mode of these networks when they're operating as in principle 10 years ago we thought they should. Not my problem, you talk, because now I'm not the medium, and using it as a violent mob. And so there's this real question of how the platforms play in terms of power, how they, and the fact that they're private corporations, monopolies, so there's no market discipline, there's no government discipline because we live in an ideology of deregulation and the government will screw it up even more. And we live in a context in which the set of threats isn't only the threats that we were talking about 10, 15 years ago, the centralizing platforms, but also these distributed models. But let me ask you, so here we are. We have hate campaigns. Do we want Facebook to be producing the intervention mechanisms? Do we want some kind of a government regulatory framework? Do we think a government regulatory framework that we now know periodically falls into authoritarianism to play the role, or do we want private companies that we know will ultimately hide things in their pocket and put things in paradise islands and block what's convenient to it? So we're really stuck between these two deeply illegitimate forms of power. And what I find so attractive about the platform co-op movement, the open cooperativism, the model of cooperativism is to say, let's actually construct a democratic platform. Let's construct a democratic infrastructure that's responsible to us. And yet, imagine that Buy Twitter succeeds. Okay. Who owns? All Twitter users? Twitter users by share, let's say all the people who follow Donald Trump get their vote in. Do we want it democratic in the sense of majoritarian? Or do we have a really strong moral commitment that it's got to work in a certain way for certain classes of people in the context of conflict? At which point you don't have a single answer. You have an answer for the United States today with its racial conflict, with its gender and religion conflict, with its deep distrust of civil service. That's one class of answers. The answers may be very different in a Denmark.
It's funny, I don't know whether to go back to the capitalism or to the Bible, but as long as we've got Felicia here, let's start with capitalism. A lot of stuff gets blamed on digital. I'm still, as angry as I am, I'm still a deep fan of digital. I'm just angry that digital has been used to amplify the worst effects of corporate capitalism. You could take the British East India Company's playbook, you can take Walmart's playbook, and Uber's playbook. It's the same one. It's extract value from people and places in order to grow capital. And what happens when people and places don't have a seat at the table is people are disenfranchised and the land is destroyed and capital grows, this bizarre abstract thing. And that turned out to dovetail beautifully with digital platforms, which are abstract and which amplify the abstracted rather than the real. So do traditional, break up, sun, oil style, anti-monopolistic policies work in this environment? And is it kind of a prerequisite for the kinds of things we're talking about? Must we kind of break up these things? And are there policies that we should be fighting for to help limit the monopolization effect of a Facebook or a Google?
I mean, I don't know if either breaking up the large platform companies, breaking up Amazon, for example, or regulating key parts of it as public utility. I don't know whether those things are sufficient to bring about the kinds of change that most of the people in this room, I assume, would seek. But I do think that it is important to consider all of those options. And what I think is really interesting that's happened sort of within mainstream politics, even in the last year, is a really in the last year, even given obviously where the balance of power now sits in Washington, I have seen so much movement and momentum toward sort of a rethinking of our antitrust policy, which has been woefully insufficient since the 1980s. A lot of people are now asking about whether the consumer welfare standard, is it sufficient? It's not being sufficiently enforced now, certainly, to deal with all the problems we're talking about. Should it be overturned entirely? Should it be? You have people as mainstream as Senator Chuck Schumer asking about really trying to much more deeply enforce all of this through channels that may or may not be sufficient, including the FTC. You have somebody who is about to become actually Schumer's nominee for the FTC, who is an ally, and none of this is confidential, it's all been publicly reported, an ally of Senator Warren's, who would very much like to move in this direction. So what I think is interesting is that in the last year, much of the energy, and I think much of the energy has come in part from realization on the part of even mainstream economists that corporate concentration is driving capitalism to work in this way that perhaps is inevitable, but that certainly is not producing shared growth. I think a lot of that very mainstream economic thinking has driven mainstream political thinking in ways that are towards antitrust in ways that are faster than I've seen in 20 years working in politics. So I think that's pretty interesting. Is it enough? No. Are we going to be better off with some of these thinkers and some of these policies being pushed as quickly as they are? I think yes.
I mean, I'm finding a lot of resistance to what it is we want is structural.
Yes.
But a lot of it is, and I don't mean to be mean here, but a lot of it is personal. A lot of it is weird, angry people. And
do you mean personal as in greed?
Hate. As in hate. I mean, I wrote it down because I wanted to ask Alicia this in the best way I could. It seems to me that resistance to collective ownership is really just resistance to sharing power with the traditionally oppressed. And it brings up the same old racist tropes. In my own efforts to promote cooperativism and co-ops and sharing, critics, not publicly, but critics have claimed that the underprivileged are disinterested and unqualified to administrate a co-op. Oh, that this is a great thing for Ithaca and all of these privileged white kids to do, but you're really going to go to the inner city and get them to do a co-op? I mean, it's people who haven't read the history of the co-op movement, but it's not only is it contradicted by the actual history of the co-op movement, but it may speak to a problem on the left of infantilizing the poor and the black, or worse, being afraid to do anything that creates true peers of those who they're trying supposedly to help. So how do we transform our conception of social good from charity, like Mark Zuckerberg, oh, I'm going to give 90% of my money to charity anyway. It's like you took too much to begin with, bastard. How do we change it to something more like true cooperation? And does ownership play a role in that somehow?
I have a lot to say about this. Let me start here. Cooperativism is not a new idea. Full stop. So let's just take the example of black farmers who through sharecropping, right, who are trying to get out of ways in which the racialized economy was already exploiting them. And so cooperativism has been a strategy for survival for communities of color and oppressed people for a long time. And so this notion that well, one, the conflation between, right, the poor and Black people is problematic. But if we were just to say that the idea that oppressed communities can't be trained to be invested in the cooperative movement is racist.
Right.
Period. Especially because these are not new ideas. And in lots of ways, these same communities that are being talked about have been innovating on cooperativism before there were like conferences and fancy language around things that people were doing to survive. And so if there's a question about why is there a gap, right? I think that is a question about organizing. And we don't have to go into all of the like pitfalls that the left falls into. I'm sure we can all kind of pick our own and run downfield. But one major thing that I think we all need to be paying attention to right now, with the left with a big L and a little l, right, is one, it's not about inclusivism. I don't really like that, right? It's actually about making sure that whatever we are doing, right, is good for everyone, and that people are not just looked at as like petri dishes to test theories, but instead are actually leading strategies and are actually being engaged in strategies, and not just being engaged in strategies that are being brought into their communities, but that they're driving and shaping those strategies. So if there's a gap, right, I often say, well, the gap is that you couldn't come into my house and tell me how to clean it and expect me to be really excited about it and take it up as a lifestyle, right? But if you came to my house and asked me, how do you clean, right? What's your method around how you manage your own life, right? And what can we learn from that? Here's my method, and where is their alignment? There's a different level of investment there. One, just because it's courteous. But two, it acknowledges, right, that even in that dynamic, there's an imbalance of power, and so we have to be thinking about how we address that.
Yeah, thanks. Because you addressed a long-standing peeve of mine, in that it feels to me like it's like, okay, now we middle-class white people are feeling something that other people have felt, and acting like, oh my gosh, we're the first. Oh, look what the internet did. And it's like, no, just join the rest of humanity now. And if anything, try to learn from what everybody else has been doing all along while we were in our nice little privileged hovels. So thank you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean. Gilded hovels. I'm a shtetl guy. So Yochai, and I wrote this one down too. You say, this because there's a quote, you say platform cooperativism offers a template and pathway for providing a more participatory, mutualist model of economic production, but must be complemented by a broader political program to orient the economy away from financialized, extractive business models and toward re-embedding the economy in society. So what do these broader political programs look like? What are the opportunities for intervention in the corporate growth model? Is it voting, boycotting, competing with them? It's hard when money seems to be able to buy the rules of engagement. Government's in the pocket of big business. Do we just ignore policy and just go to work? Do we do open source development, which seems to work really good for information production and software projects, but are they relevant in a world where people, need topsoil and water and basic sustenance?
So one reason, one point is the context in which I wrote that, or said it, I can't remember which of the two, but is the context in which cooperativism is very much this decade's iteration, platform cooperativism, not cooperativism in all of its history, but platform cooperativism or open cooperativism, variety of other, in this context of the network and digital communications, comes from a somewhat anarchistic skepticism about not only the market but also the state. And that's also the history of cooperativism, very much is anchored in the effort, whether it's Owen, whether it's Prudhomme, and later on in building we will build it for ourselves, thank you, leave your own screwed systems out of it, we're going to build it for ourselves. And so the comment there was, yes, we need to build it for ourselves. Yes, it's critical to actually create these practices that exhibit that there's a different way of doing things, but at the same time, not drop the ball in terms of translating to political practices. So the first thing is, farmer co-ops were central to the rise of the populist movement. That's a conversion into real populism out of genuine economic interest from cooperativism. That's the most lefty, aggressive moment in American politics, comes out of an important cooperative moment. But the political moment that Felicia was describing, the idea that things that were totally off the wall 15 years ago in terms of where the Democratic Party would be, single payer. Robert Rubin writes about a jobs program with millions of people as the thing that he's opposed, right, not UBI, let's not do UBI, let's do millions of people jobs program with training on the, that's a move of the Democratic Party that has taken a decade since the Great Recession, has taken half a decade since Occupy, but has really shifted the baseline of what's plausible in economics. So I see the cooperative movement as critically important in creating an imagination around the possibility that people can take responsibility for their own lives. They don't need a boss to tell them what to do, because otherwise they'll stumble over themselves. That it is possible to actually work together in a way that's effective and innovative and creative, but at the same time respectful of everybody that's together. But it's not enough to move fast enough, fully enough in a society. So what do we need? Some things we need to understand as a cooperative movement, people who really want to build the best possible technologies, at the same time should care critically about a small tax per transaction to kill off algorithmic trading and the insane short-termism that's associated with it. And that's not their problem as opposed to our problem. That's as much our problem as anyone else's. That these questions of antitrust are absolutely central and that they are part of the same movement. The flip side is, I think people who are not in the cooperative movement, people who are thinking more traditionally in terms of classic policy, securities regulation, financial regulation, labor law, and employment law, also, I think, need to see the possibility of people actually coming together and doing their own thing, and coming together in a way. So I see Mayo Fuster here from Barcelona, and the concept of moving to a public commons cooperation, a public commons partnership, instead of thinking of it as a public-private partnership, where you actually construct the city policies on the assumption that if you build spaces, there is a community that will come together around it. That if you build a participatory citizen structure, that people will communicate with it. That there is room for incubators for small and medium-sized enterprises and for unincorporated networks to actually people come together and create cooperatives and turn into cooperatives and think of that as a major design space. So I think there's room for both sides, both the more anarchic mutualist cooperative movement and the more progressive, state-oriented reform movement, to understand that the two are part of the same story, that we're moving essentially away. We need to come up with an ideology that's coherent as a replacement for neoliberalism.
We do.
That's all the way from the way the government works, knowing that government can be oppressive, not only as supportive, and not falling back on the idea that we need some nostalgia for a New Deal that cuts deals that end up, let's redistribute to everybody except for black people. we can't have that kind of nostalgia. So how do we actually construct something that's a new story, a story about us being able to do together without falling into the trap of saying, oh, that's all corrupt, the politics there, we need to deal with that too. It's all part of the same story.
So can I just add to that? Because I agree with you absolutely that we need, our lives are in fact governed, not entirely, but in large part by our belief system, by our belief systems, and I agree with you entirely that neoliberalism is dead or dying or dead. I mean, I really do think it is, and so, but it will only finally, the final nail will be in the coffin when we have a coherent belief system to replace it, and how fast that happens, where it comes from, it's going to come from a lot of different places, including the creativity of a new kind of ownership movement. So that is very important with respect to imagination, which is what you just said, Yochai. But I also think it's important because it's a source of countervailing power, right?
Yeah.
And so even if it weren't imaginative, even if it weren't narrative, you can, it wasn't, structured in terms of narrative and story and winners and losers and heroes. I do also think that one of the biggest problems with the way that large corporations are structured today, and with the movement to try to reform large corporations, is that the debate now, many people recognize that the capital markets put too much pressure on large corporations. But the debate about how to change that, how to break that, quote, short-termism, right now the mainstream debate, which is still, it's good that the mainstream's having a debate, but right now the mainstream debate is between should we take the power from, quote, activist shareholders, Carl Icahn, et cetera, and should we give it back to the corporate executives and CEOs? Like, that's the debate. That's where people see the mainstream people see the countervailing power. And I think that's basically, it's from power source A to power source B. It still leaves far too much control in the hands of shareholders, and doesn't really think about multiple stakeholders. And I think a new model of ownership that is far more genuinely democratic has to do that, to push the mainstream system into doing something different. So it's about imagination, yes, but it's also about power.
Yeah, sometimes it feels like, at least when government and corporations are fighting for control of something, it balances each other out enough for us to then get on with real life.
Distraction over here.
Yeah,
maybe.
I remember when John Barlow came out with his Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace in 1996. He said, governments of the world, get away, we don't need you, go off, where's this a new reality? He didn't say corporations of the world go away. So government went away, we got them off the net, yay! And then corporations came and took over the whole thing. It was like, if you get rid of all the bacteria in your body, then the fungus comes. It's like, you want to sort of keep them in balance, but it made the net an extreme. And I mean, we go on the net. The net, even the well-meaning people on the net have an extremely kind of a libertarian, laissez-faire understanding of it's part of the net culture, which makes me afraid. It's a strange word to use. Makes me afraid to organize online. I trust this so much more than anything that happens on there. It's like the cooperativism part is great. The platform word sometimes scares me because these technologies are so inherently biased towards alienation, towards dehumanization. I mean, the bias is not to connection.
Hang out with some Wikipedians.
It's
not inherently anything.
There's some great.
It's structured by extractive organizations to be extractive. It's not the technology. The technology isn't alienating. The social relations.
The technology doesn't allow for the several 100,000 years of rapport mechanisms that we've developed. I can't see your irises get bigger when you agree with me, or your head do micro-negative movements when you don't. But you can disagree with me here, and I feel the love. If you were disagreeing with me on Usenet, there's my age. I wouldn't feel the same love. But no, but I take your point. I mean, and even if the technologies are slightly biased away from certain things, they can easily be corrected for if you're being mindful about how you're deploying the technology rather than intentionally extractive. Or, I mean, the platforms that we're on, you all know, are made to fuck with us. You know, they're intentionally disempowering and disorienting. I was just at Tim O'Reilly's Foo Camp thing where the guy was there who had put the streak feature in Snapchat, who's now so sad he realizes what he did. He was using BJ Fogg's Keptology lab from Stanford, all the tricks that they do to make you feel terrible if you close the app, to make you anxious, and it's what the streak is for. Who really cares how many days in a row they've had a conversation with someone else? No one. It's not the point. It's to make it addictive and to make the entire space extractive. That said, here we are with a great idea and a great 2 words to express it, platform cooperativism. That's good, maybe not as good as Black Lives Matter, but it's good.
Not as good.
But what are we
Really not as good.
What do we do? In other words, how from what you've observed so far, if platform cooperative is going to be a movement, what sort of things should we do to blow this out beyond those of us, thus who want to organize platform co-ops themselves? How do we make ownership a thing?
Well, sorry, so many things swirling. Well, there's lots of experiments that are happening right now that I think it's important to link those efforts with other efforts that are trying to figure it out. Experimentation, innovation, I think is something that helps drive movements because it helps to inspire them. Yeah. One of the things that I think is probably real for a lot of us right now is that it can feel like change isn't possible. So this debate that you guys just had was really interesting, right? Because it was like, the technology is inherently extractive and bad. You were like, no, but think about it bigger, whatever. And in that, right, like I think that was a microcosm for how movements grow or die, right? So if our perception is that more is possible, which everybody here in this room believes that more is possible, it doesn't just stay like that in a static way. We have to feed that desire for more to be possible. And alongside of that, I think we have to keep bringing more people in. And not just like the nuts and bolts of our theories and kind of queries about what could be, but actually what about this is tangibly changing people's lives right now. We have to be able to articulate that at every step of the way. Black Lives Matter, for example, is one of many, right? Occupy did this. There's lots of examples of this, where it helps to explain what's possible, okay? We could have named it Stop Killing Black People, but it's not very exciting, right? Like, it's a true thing, we should stop killing Black people, but that doesn't give us any sense of what's possible, right? Saying that Black Lives Matter allows us to imagine a world where that is actually true, and it challenges us to keep imagining a world where that is actually true, even though our current reality is that it's not actually true, yeah? Third thing that I feel is really, 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 really important is the organizing piece. You can't have a movement without organizing. You cannot, I just have to keep saying this over and over, especially because as we talk about what it means to organize on these platforms that are not owned by those of us who utilize these platforms to move our social, economic, political goals, one of the things that I feel like continues to keep getting missed, it's like people say to us, oh my God, you built a movement online. And we're like, well, actually what happened was, right? We were all networked. All of us, like people.
In real life.
In real life, we're networked. So we got on a call with 200 black leaders from across the country, because we all know each other, and after Trayvon Martin is killed, we're saying, we need to do something. Here's what our response is. Can you take this out into your networks? If it's useful for you, it's yours. It's not proprietary. You don't have to say, oh, Alicia and Patrice, blah, blah, blah. We just want to see it everywhere, right? And then 200 more people do that are connected to those 200 people, and et cetera, et cetera. And the platform is where that gets amplified so that other people can see it, but it in and of itself is not the movement. And so we still have to keep kind of hammering that in. But also what feels important when I say the organizing piece, so organizing is not just amplification. So organizing is actually engaging people around what our deepest desires are and how we get there, right? And it encourages us to take responsibility for creating the pathway from where we are now to where we want to go. And so I can't emphasize that enough, right? People ask me all the time, how do I create a movement with a hashtag? I'm like, I don't know. I didn't even know what a hashtag was. I really did not know what a hashtag was. And I still am not that great. I don't tweet. You could see, I have like 36 tweets, right? I don't do that. I engage with people in real life. So if we don't think about movement building, even around platform cooperativism, and organizing as what it means to actually build and connect with people heart to heart, face to face, right? We're not going to be able to make movements possible, yeah? Last thing I'll just offer is it's so helpful to have test cases of what can be, okay? So just to give an example, yesterday, I went to my hair braider because, I wanted to look good for y'all. And she was asking me what I was doing for Thanks for Taking. And I said, I'm going to see my mom, and my mom cooks every year, and that's what we're going to do. And she says, oh, well, you need to go to this farm in East Oakland where there are live turkeys. And so instead of going to the store and buying some farmed, pumped with hormones bird, you can go to the farm in East Oakland, which nobody thinks there's farms in East Oakland, but there are farms in East Oakland, and get a fresh turkey. That had me thinking for, hours and hours. I'm like, well, what else is possible in this little place where even my imagination gets constrained? So that's what movements are made of, right? Trying things, amplifying what's possible, competing for hearts and minds, and organizing, connecting people to the responsibility of getting from where we are now to where we need to be.
It sounds like it's fun getting there.
It's easy. 1, 2, 3.
And because we're...
Just to add to that, just a few stories from the course of the day from presentations. Not to disagree, but just to add one more layer. Mm-hmm. I think some of the stories we've been hearing have to do with actually delivering for people things they need. Mm-hmm. So whether it's the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and I see Palak sitting there, that you're describing, whether it's and Camille was referencing a couple of these stories, and just to say a couple of more words. So Smart BE, why do artists suddenly want to be employed? Because they live in a system where certain social security and social services are tied to whether or not you're an independent contractor or whether you're an employee. So you have a group of people, here's a very specific regulatory benefit, together with a mutualization of revenue streams. So you live in a system where as an artist or as a freelancer, you get paid 30, 60, sometimes 90 days after you invoice. Here you mutualize that between everybody else, so you get paid within 7 days, and the organization does the credit. So it's very service-oriented and very real world. Or if we had the presentation about SCIU trying to push these. So one major issue is just building things that matter to a lot of people. The other thing we were hearing in stories today was the effort to take a bunch of things that are very distinct and understood as siloed and understanding them as a general movement toward a participatory economy and toward ownership. So Joseph Pazzi was describing ESOPs, and Camille was telling me about the first crop of genuinely democratic ESOPs that actually also include worker governance as part of the structure. To begin to understand that all of these disparate things that actually end up covering millions of people already in the United States are not exceptions to the rule of investor-owned firms, but are the way in which millions of people actually make a living. It's not a dream, it's just an ignored reality. And how you take that ignored reality and make it our sense of understanding of how we build our lives together as economic producers and social cooperators as a normal part of life, constrained as it is to live in the margins of something else that is seen as the norm. And so I think those of being practical, being actually useful to members, and at the same time being committed to telling a story that's shared together about how what we are already doing is not marginal, but central to how we can live life together.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what comes after neoliberalism.
No, and I'm also encouraged by the fact that, as you say, neoliberalism is dying. And the funny thing is, as it dies, there are a lot of organizations, a lot of even companies that are structured not as extractive corporations, but as credit unions, as cooperatives that have kind of forgotten that they're not corporations. I've been speaking to a bunch of credit unions lately that the people there don't realize they're not a bank. They don't realize that they should be optimizing for the velocity of currency through their community rather than the extraction of capital from the community to pay it back. They just don't, they forget. And so part of this feels like a kind of a great remembering, because there are a tremendous number of organizations and companies in America that are structured the way we're talking about, but they've sort of just, in their kind of desperate need to compete with these neoliberal institutions, they've sort of forgotten their core program, their base values. And part of what I think we can do is help them remember, kind of bring them out of that amnesia. And then we don't even have to, it's not from square one. It's just, oh, right, we're a co-op. We own this thing. You know, it's funny to watch people remember what their organization was about. I thought maybe it'd be good to spend the latter part of this engaging with people who've come. So it's not just some video you're watching online, but an event you're participating in. Sir.
Microphones?
I think, yeah. Oh, there's microphones on sticks.
So the conversation about the remembering, there's something that seems to me to be remembering is important, and ownership is important as well. And there's something about the remembering of ownership, that ownership doesn't just mean taking some resource out there and saying it's mine, hands off. But ownership coming from a authentic relating community, ownership is owning my experience and owning my impact. So there's something about noticing what impact I'm having on the world and taking ownership for that. Taking ownership for what change am I making in the world, and that is what I am looking at. Right? There's some sense that even in the platform cooperative movement, right, even as we're starting to look at this, if I'm thinking of it from a traditional how do I fix it approach, I'm externalizing the pain that I'm feeling as something that's out there rather than just feeling, what's the pain here? How do I actually own this pain and adjust my perspective so that I'm meeting with the people rather than trying to change them so I don't feel this pain? So I'm curious if we can somehow look at it from that perspective. Does that make sense? Does that actually, I'm curious about your perspective on, does that change in perspective give some insight into maybe what some next steps are?
Well, I mean, when you're talking, it reminds me of Stanislavski's instructions to actors who forget their line on stage or where they are or lose character, that you're supposed to start and remember, who are you really? You know, I'm Douglas, I'm playing Treplieff in Chekhov's play The Seagull. What Treplieff wants is this. So the idea that you own something, right? So you start with what's real, and then then kind of expand out in a kind of mandala. That's sort of what it was making me. That's what it was recalling for me, anyway.
I guess yes. And what you made me think about is we have a domestic worker chapter in Atlanta. And Georgia is not a state yet where we can pass one of the many bills of rights that we've been able to pass across the country. And one of the challenges that domestic workers were facing was that because it's Wild West, right? Some people were charging more, other people were charging less, folks were undercutting each other, and they didn't want to see that happen anymore. So folks built a group where they all agreed, right? That even if there's no law that says what we are worth and what our work is worth, we are all going to agree not to undercut each other, and we're going to set a baseline wage. Yeah? And in as much as we use our power, right, to punish people, we'll do that for people who continue to undercut us, even though we've already agreed that this is the wage that we're going to use. And so in that way, yes, it's about having control over your own labor and your own circumstances, but it was also very much about taking care of each other in a environment where if we didn't take care of each other, nobody else was going to do it. So solving problems that exist in people's everyday lives and finding a way to shift that so that there is actually a concrete, tangible outcome for your life, but also seeing how collectively our power can improve conditions for everyone is a great motivator. And in a lot of cases, yes, we are motivated by self-interest, and I mean, generations and generations of capitalism is not going to go away in terms of how we've learned to interact and engage with each other immediately. There are still ways in which we think about ourselves first. Our desire to compete with one another, right, is what's the word I'm looking for? It is powerful. But what is also powerful, right, is seeing how when we choose to remember that we depend on each other for survival, and that there's a better way to survive that doesn't involve slicing each other's throats, that is a great motivator. So thank you for reminding us of that.
Yeah, I have a question, or a comment. Thank you very much for this conference. My first time here, and I'm sorry for my voice. I just was singing too loud.
Go to the mic. Yeah.
Sorry. So I work at MIT in the Office of Open Learning, and I have kind of maybe a kind of question/suggestion. One of the things that I've seen is that the future of work is changing. Like automation is changing a lot of things that people do day to day, right? So that's a big bogey. That's a big problem facing us, right? But it's also an opportunity. You have also the power of legacy systems. You know, you have tenured professors, like some of you, that are basically being sustained by the legacy systems of endowment and financial investment that produce the endowment, for example. And the legacy systems are very strong, and the ones that are very, people that benefit from the legacy systems, they're not really, willing to change. And the third component, so the future of work, legacy systems, but also political activation. New York had an election, recently, only 16% of the voters showed up. And a lot of people are not just disenfranchised. So the labor of if you want to truly be cooperative, you need to start by just going to the ballot and voting, right? So there's a lot of connection between cooperativism, activation politically, learning about what the future will hold and adapting to the future, and then looking at legacy systems and say, listen, what am I willing to give up to kind of embark in this risky future? Because it's risky, some people are living the risk every day, but some people are very comfortable and don't want to live that risk.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, also culturally, we're living at a time where ownership is kind of experienced as a drag. A lot of the millennials I talk to, they don't want a car, you don't want a house, you don't want, you don't own your music, you just stream it. It's like less stuff. So ownership, in some ways we have to change the language or kind of thought around the notion of ownership. But to questions of legacies, they're embedded. Not just public university endowments, but they're embedded to the point where when I went to Uber, they were talking about UBI, universal basic income, not necessarily out of their love for the jobless future and people are, but well, if people won't have money to buy to buy our rides, or if they can't stay alive on our wages, the government will give them money, so then we'll still get it in the end. So there's UBI as neoliberalism's Band-Aid against the problems it's causing. Do you see the possibility that legacy systems will, like corporatism, will be able to initiate a few sort of cynical mechanisms to prevent the hopeful decline of neoliberalism?
Of course. I mean, the idea that talk about, hope and imagination. My regular assertion that neoliberalism is dead is, come on. Of course, it's a lot more than that.
It's death.
But I'm not 100% sure what your question is, to be honest, but
I'm asking, can it defend itself with kind of faux platform co-op style?
Yes, I think it's only going to die if a whole bunch of people in this room and outside this room, make a decision to ensure its demise. I think otherwise, look, the corporation is the most successful and powerful kind of organizational form in many ways, maybe the nation state, and for Yochai, between the nation state and the corporation, you've really got a kind of nirvana there. But the corporation is an incredibly successful form. It is not going to go quietly into the good night. So yes, I think that I think the legacy system is alive and well.
Yeah. I guess what I'm getting at is if I'm a disenfranchised teenager or 20-something, and I hear two possibilities. One, join the platform cooperative movement. You're going to join this thing. You're going to be a co-owner of this great window-making factory, and you're going to go and do stuff and participate, and they're going to be solar and great. Or Uber is going to talk to the government and give me a UBI. That's I'll sit back and watch my Netflix and YouTube. It's tricky. Do you know what I mean? I feel like there's
I don't actually agree with that, though. But we can have that conversation if you want, but I just don't think that's right. I think, sorry to get a little researchy, but all of the, I'm actually, I've thought a lot about the idea of a basic income, the idea that whether it's $250 a month, $1,000 a month, to everybody as a kind of base income. I've thought a lot about whether this is a good idea morally and ethically, where the money would come from, whether this is going to cause inflation, what the labor market effects would be, et cetera, et cetera. So the one, I don't yet know where I come down on that, but the one thing I will say is that I think all the evidence suggests, again, getting a little researchy, is that you are not going to see people simply sitting back watching their Netflix. I think I do think that every time that we have seen some kind of experiment, policy, citywide, regionally, to actually basically give people money, you've seen very little reduction in work. You've seen people be more productive, by and large. Yeah, on the margins, sure. But you're going to see things happen on the margins with any group of people. So I'm not sure that.
And you see an increase in entrepreneurial risk-taking as well.
You can. Anyway, I'm not sure how we got here from a platform cooperative conversation, but I just wanted to make a comment.
Well, because he was talking about future of work, so it sort of brings up UBI. And one of the ways that neoliberalism is trying to compete, I think, with what we're doing is by offering a kind of cynical visions of the future that could entice some people.
Well, the only thing I'll say about future of work, and I think that Yochai and Alicia both have thought about it a tremendous amount, and I'd love to hear what they think as it relates to the platform cooperative conversation more generally. But there's nothing inevitable about what's going to happen in the future of work. I think there's a series of choices that we as human beings can make, simply because automation will make technological advances we can make a set of choices about how, when, whether to employ those advances and to what ends. So I think that particular nuance has been lost in the entirety of the future of work conversation over the last 5 years. It's worth remembering.
Yeah. Is there another? You're up there with the mic.
There's more questions up
Oh,
here.
good.
Okay.
Thanks for this amazing conversation. You all have talked a lot about capital and power, and we talked a little bit about race and a little about gender, but I would love to hear anyone on the panel or all of you reflect a little bit more on the intersection between race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ability, and so on as it relates to the conversation about the construction of new types of firms, platform cooperatives, and the future of work. My worry is that the platform cooperativism conversation, and we did talk about this in terms of the history of Black cooperativism and the way that it's being erased in the current conversation about the digital economy and its possibilities. But yeah, I'm just wondering if we could go a little bit deeper in that conversation, because if we don't, then we end up with, both in terms of the design processes we use to create these things, where we have well-meaning, middle class, largely cis white men, frankly, saying, I think it would be really cool if we built this thing and then made this wonderful platform co-op. But the design process itself is not inclusive. It doesn't respect the mandate of the disability justice movement, nothing about us without us. And it frankly will potentially produce this small sector of firms that are nice for the knowledge workers who are doing things on them, but won't reach that massive scale of transforming not only the US economy, but the global economy if we're not intersectional in the way that we build, think about, plan for, and dream of the possibilities of platform cooperativism.
Baby. So, thank you. I have a lot of fears, and all of them are the ones you just named. So, so I spend a lot of time trying to combat my own cynicism, but that's not cynicism. That's a question about how do we equitize power, right? So we're trying to think about that with domestic workers, right? Because, like I said, the way that this is impacting us and our base, right, is that the marketplace that was already wild before is now in a realm that we're trying like hell to impact and shape, but it's really hard. It's really, really hard. It's like we're farther and farther away from the mechanisms that control our lives. And it is very much because, not just because we're workers, right, but also very much because we are women, we are trans folks, we are immigrant, we are Black, brown, of color, right? We are folks with different abilities, different bodies, right? And we also care for and support people who have different bodies, right? And I worry a lot about what it means in practice to actually make all of these spaces more equitable. Because I'm not gonna lie to you, like I'm up here and I'm looking around and I'm like, shit, I'm one of like 4 Black folks in this room, right? And so what is that? And that's not to say this isn't valuable, it is valuable. But it also begs the question of like, how do we make sure, right, that that we understand that there's levels to this. I was just also sitting here thinking about, I live in East Oakland, right? So nobody that lives in my neighborhood they're not tech workers, right? And our big struggle right now that we're thinking about is around cannabis, right? So you have this whole industry that was imprisoning Black and brown people. Now it's becoming lucrative for white people. And we're clawing tooth and nail to try to figure out how do we shift the dynamics of power within this industry so that more people can benefit. In particular, the people who've been criminalized for it. Now that it's legal, right? Yeah. We're seeing a whole different kind of conversation happen. So I just want to appreciate you raising that, and I don't have the answers at all. We're testing stuff with domestic workers and trying to figure out, knowing that we are on really different scales of power, right? That's why we keep thinking like we just need to have our own stuff. We need to have our own stuff because maybe we can't compete, right? Maybe the way that we compete is actually building something better that we control and we shape and we direct, and we become a model for what's possible, and we inspire not just our movement and the left, right? But we're also competing with the folks that are trying to kill us, straight up. So we're trying to figure it out, but I really appreciate you raising that.
I mean, another answer is when does the co-op start? In other words, there's so many well-meaning people who are ready to code, I'm going to code this whole techno-solutionist thing and then deliver it to the co-op and then they'll own it. No. They have to own the process from day one, and then it's whoever's present rather than and I met them. That was last weekend. I met all these folks who have, the solution for the bad algorithms on Facebook is, I got a better algorithm here, and we'll put this one on and that one on. And it's well-meaning, but yeah, it's prescriptive, and it can't be inclusive because it wasn't including in its inception. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question about how do we decide who belongs? I think there was a lot of discussion about how do we make everything more equitable, how do we distribute power, but I wanted to know what your thoughts on who is involved in this, who should be here. And there was a slight discussion about whether when making Twitter more democratic would be bad, because what would the Trump supporters do? Would they have to leave? But I think what's missing there is all of the people who had to leave Twitter because they were getting harassed or they were getting death threats, or all the people who couldn't join Twitter because they never had internet, or they just didn't have access to that technology. And this is very close to my personal experience because I grew up in Iran, and whenever there was a US election, we would all be watching the TV, because whoever would get voted here could maybe determine whether or not I'm gonna get the medicine that I need to live. But no one there is given a ballot. So how do we talk about these questions of democracy and distributing power without talking about who is involved or who belongs?
So I guess I'm partly responsible for part of your question. I certainly didn't mean that my problem with democratizing Twitter is that it would exclude Trump followers. My concern was the sense that democratization and user ownership would lead to attractive results, because user ownership would mean everybody, and the platform includes lots of people who are members because they're users, but who have deeply illiberal and anti-democratic impulses for how to use it. And as we're seeing across the world, the rise of illiberal majoritarian leadership, all the way from Duterte through Modi to Erdogan, and where was it? Just a couple of hours south of here. Illiberal democracy rising. That was what I was talking about. But the question of membership is a genuine question for all cooperatives. And I think one of the things, in some sense, we're in a mode at the moment of trying to get people not in the weeds of how we build sometimes, but this kind of conversation is more, what's the dream? Mm-hmm. But there's no question that there's a long history of co-ops, and the inside-outside is enormously important. One of the core struggles of co-ops over generations that have been successful have been what happens when the founder generation wants to retire, what happens when there are new people, and often what you see is that the cooperators become the new capitalists with a new generation of employees who themselves now have the boss-employee relationship and don't really have an easy transfer into the cooperative. One of the debates you see in the more traditional cooperative movement, big consumer co-ops have the question, do they buy from farmer co-ops or do they buy at the best prices? What is their duty to their members? To buy for a little more from the farmers who are part of the co-ops or not? So this question not only of who's inside and outside the co-op movement, but who's inside and outside my community of care in the co-op is central as a boundary definition for all co-ops. It's a struggle that we've seen throughout the cooperative movement. I think there are certainly places, and I think you had mentioned Mondragon earlier, or maybe it was in one of the earlier panels, there are certainly solutions where you have networks of co-ops successfully mutually reinforcing each other and having an ambition towards politically expanding their power throughout the region. The problem is we all keep coming back to the same two examples, right? We all tell the story of Mondragon, we all tell the story of the Emilia-Romagna, and then what? And that's been true for decades. So I think that's a real question we have to deal with, and this is an event where on one hand we're trying to persuade each other that the dream is real enough to be worth dreaming, and on the other hand we're trying to help each other learn how do we not screw it up this time. And I think that kind of question is really valuable.
We should do maybe two more, and then let people go to their festivities.
Do it.
Are you miking?
Yeah, I was just trying to, make sure that there was no one else who wanted to go. Yeah, my platform co-op was a new concept for me when I came here today, but I've been fairly heavily involved in the food co-op world for probably about 10 years. And I'm also fairly involved in, technology. And I've observed sort of a generational component here, and to a certain extent also a loss of history, to a certain extent. The Rochdale, I think everyone is familiar with the Rochdale Weaver story. That's sort of this, origin story. But for example, in New York City, some of the first cooperatives were actually in Harlem, started by a fellow from Barbados. And then there was also, I think, a wave in the 30s. There was definitely a wave in the 70s. And this is where I sort of started seeing this, as I went to a cooperative conference in Indiana, and a lot of the co-ops that started in the 70s were functioned based on member labor, direct involvement, and from the 70s to the 2000s, due to consolidation in the food industry, and I think also just cultural shifts. There's a huge separation between the people who are starting up hacker spaces, starting open source software, and the people who've participated in, I think, older organizing, whether it had to do political, economic, social, food. And so I was just wondering, sort of giving this as an opportunity to say, if you had any stories of overcoming and connecting these generational issues in your work. Or if you see, I don't know, just sort of a general, to speak to the issue of generational disconnects, old organizing, new technology.
I said one round, so maybe.
For me, it's the university's been. I've only been at professor for 3 years, but students come in, especially people in their 20s, and they think it's novel. So they'll say, oh, I read something on platform cooperative, as if it's this brand new idea, which is sweet and wonderful, that's fine. But then when the beauty of education, however endowed it may be, and we're not, unfortunately, it is you can then give them the literature and let them see, oh, this exists, to connect them not just with the echo, but with the actual movements that they think are new. I mean, that's the beauty of it.
But I think there's also, there's an interesting question of how we conceive of ourselves, how to do it. I'm going to, instead of repeating the question of the problem of generational transfer, just leverage this point about this is new and exciting. So I'm about to say something and I have no idea whether it's true. I was at a conference a few weeks ago that was all economists. I sometimes do this. It's a socialization practice. And it was about platform economics, and various of us were talking. You can imagine not everybody was doing cooperativism. And one of the people was enthusiastically describing, and if there's anybody here who knows the fact that these are wrong facts, these were the facts described enthusiastically, how a neighborhood of young professionals in Brooklyn had decided to create an alternative energy platform where they would essentially create a platform where they would all put up solar panels and they would sell each other through the platform. It would be a market. It would be like Uber for energy that they'd produce. They'd essentially do load balancing between their different systems and use each other's houses as batteries, as it were, to get smooth. Great idea. Why in the universe would people mobilize towards environmental stewardship, imagine their relationship with each other as market relationship as opposed to a cooperative? Functionally, they would be doing the same thing, right? Functionally, what would they be doing? They'd be putting the panels on the roof. They'd be implementing a networked structure for load balancing their demand. And they'd be using some unit of account to see who's drawing more and who's drawing less in order to manage it. But they would have some participatory structure for how to structure it. They would presumably construct some component to actually give back to others in a community or use the money to reinvest in some sort of collaborative model. So there's a conception, and the battle in this regard between the obscenely named sharing economy companies and the actual sharing and collaborative and open cooperative economy is this question of how we conceive of each other. And what this generation of people at various ages, from teens through, let's say, young people, conceive of what's the normal way of doing things when they're trying to solve this kind of problem. And that's a generational shift that's conceptual that I think is up for grabs now. That this kind of event and this kind of conversation, I think, needs to be there in order to get it be the normal way of doing things. Is we're going to do it together as a neighborhood. Why in the universe would we think of creating a market between us neighbors?
Yeah.
I'd like to I know we have a couple lined up, so I'm sorry to take your space. But I'd like to make sure that we address something for us as a field, because many of us came from a conference that we were all at today, and there's a desire to make this a mainstream conversation. There's a desire to have this part of the policy conversations that are shaping the federal agenda, part of the conversations that are integrating into movements. And so specifically for you two, Felicia and Alicia, what are the things that might hold you back from embracing this concept and as something that can be transformative in the type of change that you both are trying to make? And how can we start the conversation or the action or whatever it takes to move past those barriers that you're feeling?
Well, I'll start. Just quickly, it's an interesting question given the tenor of the conversation up until now, because most of the conversation up until now has been the importance of an alternative model, an alternative imagination, a way to show what is possible in contradiction to the mainstream, which is one way to think about it. I think there is, and I'm sure you know this, I think that anything that would become part of the not just the mainstream Washington conversation, but any mainstream kind of academic conversation, cultural conversation, business conversation, things get watered down very quickly. That said, and I'm sure you've thought about it, that caveat aside, I mean, in all seriousness, if you really want this to be part of the mainstream Washington conversation, I think situating it within this idea that there is a huge shift right now in the way people think about how the economy works. There is no question about that. I think that the financial crisis started that. I think it took the crisis. I think it took Occupy. I think it took great pieces of journalism. And I also think it took really good economists who were willing to get out there and say, actually, there is a different way to imagine, including Joe Stiglitz, with whom we work, but, Robert, a handful of prominent economists who were willing to go against their Nobel Prize winning colleagues to say that a different way of conceptualizing the economy is possible, and by the way, is not going to kind of, bring either growth or civilization to a shrieking halt. So I do think that all those things were important. I do think now is a moment of huge openness in the political system. Donald Trump won. And now, things that we thought were not possible in the mainstream political system are now possible. They're possible for ill, obviously. They're also, I think, possible for good. But what it's really going to take, I think, to get the platform conversation, part of the Senate Democratic Caucus lunch, is blah, 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 is like a lot of work that is sort of, it's a lot of organizing work, yes, but then there's a lot of work that's kind of boring. I think you've got to do the analyses. What are the various financing mechanisms? Can it scale? If you had to pencil this out and budget it, what would it really look like? Is it going to cause, what are the deficit effects going to be vis-a-vis any of the other big ideas out there for changing how the economy works, whether it's a job guarantee or baby bonds or universal basic income or 90% top marginal tax rates on the very wealthy. All these things are now out there in the conversation in ways that are very serious, and actually some of them actually are part of the Senate Democratic Caucus lunches, which is kind of crazy, but that is now happening. So, okay, if you want this to be part of it, you got to kind of dress it up in the language that people already know, which has a lot of footnotes. So I know nothing about how any of this would pencil out or compare to other things or look in a way. You all do, I don't. But if that is what you want, that is what it's going to take. Or, that's what it took to get UBI from a few kind of, whether for good or for ill, whether, kind of bad legacy people or dreamers who just want economic security for all. That's what it took to get UBI, which has moved extraordinarily quickly from a few crazy people to extremely mainstream in the conversation. Well, extremely mainstream in my conversation, I don't know. That has moved in 18 months. Oh, the other thing it takes funders to care about it. Like rich people, very rich people, to say that it's at least worth, and they've got to pay for the studies to pencil it out. They've got to kind of whisper in their senator's ear. But it's totally possible. I would ask if that's really what you want, but it's totally possible in this moment. That's what I think.
Yeah, I don't know that I need convincing. This is work that we're trying to figure out, and I think even in the movement for Black Lives, there's lots of conversation about how do we bring about not just equity and parity, right, but how do we repair the harm that's been done? And this is getting us closer. It doesn't get us there, but it gets us closer. The thing that I just struggle with all the time was what I said earlier, which is the question of ownership in and of itself doesn't guarantee, right, that, that other axes of power are being addressed. And I don't have an answer to how that happens, so it's not a all or nothing kind of a thing. It's a yes and. We have to keep paying attention to how do we make sure that this doesn't become or stay a white middle class thing where folks have the luxury and the leisure to be testing and experimenting with new forms of ownership and economy in its most basic form, right? And so I'm appreciative of the points that you're raising around how do we solve problems for everyday people as a way to test that, and also as a way to lift up where do we need to go deeper. Yeah.
Should we do one last question? He's been standing up there.
Thank you. I just wanted to echo and following on that directly, but the question about who is included as the potentially unifying force for what we're doing here. The basic concept in a cooperative, sort of underlying everything that I don't think has come up here, is that the people who are affected should be the one in control. And so that is a unifying statement that you can apply outside the cooperative world to how politics should work. And right now we have a handful of rich people making decisions that affect the vast majority. And so if we just sort of take as one of our unifying principles in the cooperatives movement, and therefore the platform cooperativism movement as potentially one of the most including of the cooperative forms that we can have, but that we have to be really intentional about who is included, and which means we have to do the organizing work, it means we have to do the reaching out. We have to, that we can't just sit and see who comes, that we have to organize and mobilize, but that we're intentional about the idea that we need to take more power for people, and that we need to help people organize. We need to help ourselves organize and take power, and be really intentional about who is included in having control over their lives. And it should be everybody, and people who have the least control are where we need to help bring the most resources and power. And so the question of who is included and who we try to reach out to first is sort of something that really unifies the idea of cooperativism, platform cooperativism, and the larger political, economic, social world that we need to change. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Rob, you had a question or a thing? You can do it from there. Save us time.
So, I'm Rob Call. I host Bottom Up Radio, publish op-ed news. So, the roots of cooperativism go back since the beginning of humanity. And before civilization, hunter-gatherer bands were all cooperative groups. That's the way they function. Those are our roots. We have 7 million years of evolution with epigenetic factors that have potentiated us to be cooperative. Civilization flipped that around. Industrial society flipped that around from a bottom-up culture to a top-down culture. And now we're starting to come back. This whole aspect of the way we are. Now, neoliberalism is a terrible, horrible affliction upon humanity that has basically engaged in privatization and the enshrinement of the all-powerful. And what Yochai said and a couple of you said is we need a new narrative that replaces neoliberalism, because it's become the dominant story. George Monbiot has a great book out on it right now. He proposes some ideas on that. Now, Doug, you've written a whole bunch about story, and you've described how there's a new model of narrative. How do you envision a narrative that would flip this? And the last thing is, we don't live in a linear world where you just have to add up to make change happen. We live in a non-linear world that emergent properties can explode and change everything. And that gives me a lot of hope, because things can change really quickly. And we can look at MySpace as an example of the biggest platform ever that just fell apart. And it could happen with Facebook, and it could happen with these other giant platforms as well. The narratives have to do it, and then we've got all these epigenetic factors that potentiate who we are as cooperative people. And so it's a matter of coming up with a story. So how do you envision this story that could do that?
It's not a bad last question.
Well, two-column accounting from the Renaissance initiated the zero-sum mentality we have about money, because everything that's debited gets credited. And it led to a really closed, non-reciprocally altruistic understanding of the market and the economy and all. At the same time, I think that linear narratives with beginnings, middles, and ends addicted our culture to getting to the end of the story. Where's it going to go? That's why it's easier for people now to imagine a zombie apocalypse than it is for them to figure out what's going to happen in the next election. And it's actually a happier vision, but it's an end. So I think when you kind of combine those two things, sort of narrativity and economic models, zero-sum economic models, what we want to do is move towards stories that don't end, stories that open, stories that are about the choices that you're making as you're moving through them, rather than watching some hero, some usually white guy with short hair, some Greek citizen going through his thing and getting the vicarious thrill of his comeuppance. So the new narratives, I think, are participatory narratives, narratives without endings, never-ending stories, infinite games, circular finance that promote the velocity of money rather than its storage, because you're not working to save for retirement. You're working to create a culture of mutual aid amongst you and your peers. So that happens, but the way that story happens, I think it happens through experience maybe before it happens through, these are the stories we hopefully get to tell our grandchildren, about how we're now living, rather than some story we tell in order to get people to do something. What's the one sentence I really don't like? And we've said it a lot tonight, and I've said it too. It's not, how do you get people to do this or get people to do that? Once we're in that conversation, we've already lost. So I'm real interested to hear what stories people will tell, who've been part of this movement.
I don't know if you want to go or...
Please.
So I actually want to take you up much more directly on this, because I actually think the people in this room, at least the people who came to the conference and came over here, are actually part of a 20-year narrative that has used the affordances of the net, and I wouldn't locate it with the Netscape IPO. I would push it much later to the emergence of the App Store and the cloud and the model of concentration there, because there was a decade of tremendous experimentation. Right? Take a group of economists in 1996, put them in the room and say, there's this one group of engineers who's the biggest software company in the world, and their next strategic move is web servers. There's another loosely coupled network of people who aren't going to use property. They're going to share all the, nobody's going to own the software, and they're going to share it. Which one of these will be dominant over the next 20 years? You would have been laughed out of the room. And yet it moves. And so does Wikipedia. So it's important to understand that the cooperativism, or the platform cooperativism movement, has strong roots in a moment in intellectual history, in shared narrative, in social practice, and in technology, where things that were utterly impossible, given the state of the knowledge in 96 or 2000 or 2002, became the commonplace platforms on which we actually ran our lives. And the emergence of the concept of the commons as not there's property and incentives and markets and tragedy of the commons, as opposed to actually everything is running on an interaction between property and commons. You couldn't have the network without a fundamental, rich, robust commons. You can't say cooperation doesn't work and everybody ultimately is self-interested as the core model of rational action, and then also explain Wikipedia without tying yourself into Copernican, into Ptolemaic epicycles, ignoring the fact that the world no longer operates with the Earth in the center and the sun going around it because something else is true. So I actually think there's a very strong internal narrative coming from this movement that's actually translatable into locations of power, people in Silicon Valley, people in policy positions, that you can anchor things they care about: innovation, growth, sustainability, in a narrative of we're fundamentally cooperative, these things run, they're creative, and now we add another layer of, with money, participatory, peer production, commons-based practice, with money and the ability to make a living, as a contribution into a conversation that, as we've had here, can't also be purely, we're just looking at ourselves and it's only the stuff we've been doing. By we, I mean this particular narrative. That's where I've lived my last 25 years. It's not only we're doing, and creating those bridges between these. But I think we actually have a very good story to tell about the possibility of large-scale cooperation that is effective, that is innovative, that is enabling of tremendous growth in welfare while being participatory, while being actually self-governed, while being an enormously attractive model of structuring life, that now we can combine with other stories that are in a much more grounded, real-world domains of life that will expand politically much broader. But I do see a lot of what we're doing here as building on 20, 25 years worth of narrative of possibility of cooperation as our contribution to this shared narrative that we're producing across several sectors of pushing against the dominant model to create an alternative.
Great. Any responses to that you want to add in, or last thoughts? All right, well, with that, I would really like to thank everybody, our moderator and our panelists. Thank you so much for coming and having this dialogue with us. As I said, we've got more conference stuff tomorrow if you want to dive in deep with us, and enjoy your Friday nights. It's time to go grab a drink. All right, thank you all.